This episode is sponsored by Assault Fitness. Assault has been a part of Power Monkey Camp for a long time. We've incorporated the runners, bikes, and rowers in our endurance sessions, as well as the competitions that we have at camp and our nightly workouts. Check out the full lineup of machines at assaultfitness.com. Welcome to the Power Monkey Podcast, where we chat with the best in the world of fitness about what they do. I'm your host, Dave Durante, with my co-host, Mike Service, and on today's episode, we have a return guest, Mr. Chris Gatti. Chris is a wealth of information when it comes to handstand training. He was a gymnast at the University of Michigan, graduating back in 2005, and later went on to perform for Cirque Du Soleil for many years. Along with being an incredible teacher and performer, Chris has gone on to get a master's in biomedical engineering, as well as a PhD in the area of machine learning and data analysis. He has applied this in-depth background into some fascinating studies around handstand mechanics. We'll save that for another episode, but there are some really interesting insights that he's been able to come up with. With that being said, today's episode is a little bit different. We've had Chris on in the past, as I mentioned, and we talked about his background, but today we're going to have a little debate on how Chris and I might tackle different handstand clients depending on their starting points. There are many areas where we agree and maybe some where there's still debate going on. I had a great time chatting with Chris about some of these little nuances of handstand training and how we apply it to our athletes that we work with both in person and remote. And I know there are a lot of talking points in here that you'll be able to apply to not only your own athletic performance, but also to the coaches out there that might be able to apply some to the athletes that they work with. We hope you enjoy this one. Chris, what's up, man? It's always good to see you. It's been a while. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. How you doing?
My pleasure. I'm doing really well.
Good to hear. I just got to start off the conversation by saying that I was out in your former neck of the woods recently. I was in the gym at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor last weekend with a bunch of your former teammates and checking out the team. Over the years, I've been in that gym quite a bit. I'm sure it holds a very special place in your heart. Can you give us a little bit of maybe a memory or something you remember about being in that gym from back in the day?
Yeah, I was on the team from like 2000, 2005, and I mean it was here and there 4 or 5 hours a day in college training, and I mean that was just like my home. It was where I could play and whatnot. I think the my favorite time was the redshirt year, my junior year, where I was coming back from surgery and I wasn't competing, and I could just like play. And so like I would just play on high bar doing lots of crazy stuff, just playing with the releases, just like trying to get a handle on all those skills, but it just didn't have the pressure of competition, and that's why I liked that time a lot, I think.
Do you still follow along with the team right now and Richards and how good the team is stacking up for this upcoming year?
A little bit. I don't pay attention as much as I did, but I keep an eye on them here and there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just got to bring it up because Stanford has not lost in for hopefully
Here we go.
5 years now. And I've just been told many times that while Oklahoma is good, that Michigan is the one that's going to give them the most run for their money. And they have Fred Richards, who's just an absolute monster, one of the best guys in the country, potentially the world, leading into Paris' upcoming summer. So it should be a very friendly battle between our two schools come the end of April for NCAA championships this year. So good luck and go Card.
Likewise.
All right. So I'm going to pass it now to Mike because we have a unique structure that we're going to be putting into play today for the podcast. And obviously with your background being an expert in everything gymnastics and handstand related, we're going to get into some of those topics and see how we approach maybe working with different clients from different backgrounds. So pass it to you, Mike, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, everybody that's listening, if you were into the squat jerk quote unquote debate that Cheryl and I had a couple of weeks ago, we're going to kind of continue with that and use the opportunity here to pick Dave and Chris's brains a little bit and offer some scenarios for them to go through where they're going to be presented with hypothetical client that might sound like one of you that are listening. We'll go through some different levels of clients and ask them each how they would approach a coaching scenario, and then give them each some opportunity to not necessarily have a rebuttal, but see where maybe they would do things different. Maybe one will be inspired by the answer that the other gives and build upon that, or offer some affirmations. And then once we feel good about the scenario and have worked through it, we will move to a higher level athlete with another question. So if you guys are ready to get rocking, the only stipulation will be is because we can all get a little bit long-winded in our answers, since we're so passionate about what we do, we will have a timer. So Dave kept his timer a couple weeks ago on Cheryl and I. I would like to say that I finished under my time almost every time. But then Cheryl, to the surprise of all of us, almost never went over. And anybody that knows Cheryl knows that she is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom, and she's good with words, so she can go on. So she
We will
crushed
do our
it as
best,
well.
Mike. We'll do our best to emulate what you guys did the other day.
I believe in you guys. I believe in you guys. So I don't know. I don't know if we want to do a coin flip or want to do, like, Chris is the visitor, so we give
Yeah,
him the
start
first
off with
opportunity,
Chris being the
Dave.
guest. Absolutely.
All right, so Chris, I'm going to give you scenario number one. This is going to be a little more of like a beginner level athlete or a newbie. And you're going to have Jordan, make sure I'm saying it correctly. He's going to have 3 minutes, right? Yeah. So Chris is going to have 3 minutes to offer his advice, his suggestions, and then Dave will follow that up with a 5-minute response and add on. So Chris, you ready to rock?
Let's go.
All right, so here we go. Scenario number one. I got to look at my notes to make sure I get it right. Chris, what would your approach be to help a client get inverted for the first time if they've never been upside down and are scared or nervous? I just want to give one caveat. There are no physical limitations, and they definitely have the strength to support themselves overhead. So you don't have to worry about those things. So when you start talking, I'll start the timer and I'll let you know when you have about a minute left.
Awesome. With the main thing being psychological limitations, I mean, you want to make sure they're safe. They don't kind of go into that extreme sort of scared range, where they're in a situation where they're just going to freak out more and more and be scared of the activity in general. So you want to make sure you progressively put them in situations where they feel like, okay, I had a slight doubt, but I feel like I can support myself. I'm okay being upside down. And maybe that's not completely inverted in the beginning. Maybe that's just kind of like feet on a box and they're just kind of holding mostly their upper body, slowly progressing the height up with that. If they feel comfortable sort of getting to somewhat of a higher height, or doing like a chest to the wall, sort of at a tilted position, so they're not completely inverted and there's no risk of falling over whatsoever. They feel pretty good with that, and I've established sort of trust in how I'm working with them and how they're taking directions and whatnot. Then I'll propose like kicking up, where I have hands on them in a almost manhandling way, where I really have a good contact on a leg. I can fully support them. That's if they're psychologically comfortable for that, and I can basically fully support them up to a spotted handstand. There's no question that they're going to fall over. I have their legs. I have their weight. I say how long we're holding it. I ask them how they're doing, so they're comfortable and they're in communication with me. As they come down, I grab their hips, so I support them as most of their weight. They step down, and we kind of review and whatnot. I think most people that have the strength starting off like that, and they have that psychological limitation, I mean, I can probably go through those steps within 45 minutes or so, walking through a variety of drills.
All right, Chris, I like that answer. We stayed just under 2 minutes, so that's a good starting point for us. And then Dave, I think you'll be able to have some fun and take your turn. I'll start the 5-minute clock.
Yeah, I mean, what Chris said is spot on in terms of the way that I would approach it. So I'll just kind of elaborate from my approach between maybe a remote client and also an in-person client, which may have slightly different limitations. Two things to mention. I think a lot of people that we work with in the CrossFit and functional fitness world have a tendency to think that handstands are all or nothing. And the reason why it's scary to them is because they're kicking up back to wall and they can't do it. It's frightening to actually go inverted for the first time. And what I think the suggestions that Chris was giving was understanding that there are angles to the handstand. There are progressions to help you feel what it's like to have weight on your hands, to be able to feel what it's like to be inverted without getting fully to that vertical position. So just elaborating on one of the ones that I find to be incredibly helpful, just an angled wall hold. Now, in our space, most people will think about it as a wall walk, where they're going all the way inverted, hands very close to the wall, because in most workouts or applications, they're trying to think about that as the completion of the movement. That is just the standard. Don't worry about getting the hands all the way to the wall. Think about it as one little incremental step closer and closer to the vertical position, where you're getting a positional component in place. You're getting to understand what the breathing pattern is supposed to look like. You're getting to understand what it's, just from a spatial awareness perspective, what it's like to get more and more inverted. Those angles and every little incremental step is hugely valuable to someone that's a little bit uncomfortable. On top of that, I would really recommend, yes, spotting, the way that Chris was saying, getting a handle of the person's leg, understanding how to position yourself to create confidence and comfort for the person that is a little bit scared. You, as a spotter, as a coach, are incredibly important in conveying that confidence to them. So, one of the things that we've been preaching is more hands-on experience, working in groups more. If you have the ability, have two spotters get into place so that you have someone on each leg, so that you can really make sure that person is feeling comfortable. Then going from two spotters down to one, making sure the person is understanding this is a weaning off of process, more of a tool with the spotting as opposed to it being a crutch. Additionally, last thing I would mention is a kick-up process, right? One of the things that people really have a hard time with, especially as they start moving away from the wall into a freestanding type of a setup, is, you don't have any comfort of knowing that the wall is there to catch you. And people will just kick up, and that's where the fear kicks in. I'm going to fall on my back. I don't know how to bail out of it. I don't know how to pirouette or roll. And it becomes a really fearful type of a situation. So what I've done over the years is create kind of a kick-up process where you start very low to the ground and just get the hands down to the ground, understand which leg is your lunge leg, which leg is your kick leg, where do your hands need to be placed? Can we slowly come off the ground, get repetitions in terms of building movement pattern in place so the person feels more and more comfortable, just the pattern is ready to say, hey, you know what? I feel comfortable at least putting my hands down on the ground. Let's start to kick up a little bit more aggressively and take this angle by angle, rather than thinking the handstand needs to be all or nothing, getting fully inverted is the end all be all.
Oh man, you guys are crushing it on being concise today. So Dave, just about 3 minutes there. I like it. Just for everybody that's listening, and I'm by no means the expert here, but I want to paraphrase, sum up. Both of these guys are telling you that there are ways to do it without just kicking up and falling over. So that's what, we see as such a fear factor so often. So really, really nice to hear both of you guys kind of on the same page. And I'm ready to move on to the next one if you are.
Unless Chris wants to follow up and
All
add
right.
anything additional to my comments. Got a couple more minutes there.
Got it. Okay. So, listeners, apologies. I am failing already on my moderator duties. So, Chris, you now have 2 minutes to either tell Dave that he completely misinterpreted you and he's wrong, continue to affirm him, or go a little bit deeper. So, Chris, I'll start your 2-minute clock now.
No, all good points there. I think going into the fact that handstand is not all or nothing is incredibly important, and that applies to every single level of hand balancing. You can slice drills and skills incredibly thin, and you have to. And if you want to sort of see progress, if you want to feel differences in situations, it's incredibly important to take the smallest little steps at every single level. It doesn't matter if you're completely a beginner that has never been upside down, or someone training one-arm handstands and whatnot. That's a staple in my process. And yeah, for the kick up, I mean, certainly doing a process for that is critical. I think in the first session, just getting someone upside down, and if we can get to the point where we're psychologically comfortable with that, then yeah, we can start to layer on refining the kick a little bit, so it becomes not just, okay, it's only upside down. We work sort of a basket of things that sort of rounds out the process of developing a handstand in general.
Can I jump in? I want to just elaborate on something and ask Chris an additional question.
Absolutely. We've got some time left in this round.
All right. Cool. So, Chris, one of the things that I normally teach around the kick up process is that it really is a stepping stone to what would be the next level. And I never want people to train in the CrossFit and functional fitness world, train towards a standard, because those standards are constantly changing, and it kind of creates an exposed situation as an athlete when they're only preparing for one thing. The technique is not set foundationally, and then they're kind of exposed as an athlete as those standards change. So with regards to like a kicking up action, I'm asking this more from maybe an artistic gymnastics approach versus a hand balancing approach. Going down to the ground, and the patterns that I normally teach people are with regards to, yes, kicking up to a good handstand and what's preparing them for becoming more comfortable there, but also understanding that the kick up pattern builds towards tumbling, essentially. And going down to the ground, creating length with your lunge, creating some space between where your hands are being placed, will eventually lead towards being able to understand what going down to the ground for a hurdle into a roundoff or a front handspring is supposed to look like. So for me, it's all about setup and preparation for how it can be applied beyond just the handstand into bigger gymnastics type movements. From your perspective, in the hand balancing world, there's, I think, less value in terms of how that approach might be applied. But can you tell me what you think in terms of both of those setups? Do you find it to be valuable to create a kick-up pattern that would eventually lead to something like tumbling in your space, or does that have a completely different type of an approach in your mind?
I think I'm going to answer it even more broadly, perhaps, in that I think it's incredibly valuable to like, put the person in situations or give them scenarios where they have to adapt and they have to sort of uh, uh, respond to some amount of variability and be able to change things sort of on the fly. So it isn't sort of one particular technique, and they can have changes throughout them, and they can make it adaptable for like a front handspring instead of just a kick handstand or something like that. So I mean, I think that speaks to more developing the person and the creative mind and the creative body as a whole, and like what they can do with their body. And then if you enable them to do that, and you teach them the process of figuring out how to handle that variability and adapt, I mean, they can do anything they want in time. Then.
All right, I love that answer, and I want to remember what Chris just said there, because if we have time at the end, I want to get back to that response and see if we can just spend a couple of minutes talking about hand positioning for the handstand and come back to that. All right. So if we have time on it, let's come back to that comment and see if we can apply it to another conversation point. Go for it, Mike.
If we have time, then Jordan, I'm going to call on you to bring that back up as the topic to finish on. Yeah, no, guys, we're making good time. So scenario 2, Dave, we'll start with you on scenario 2. So we now have a client that's able to go into a handstand. They have no problem being inverted, no physical limitations, but they're not able to find their balance point. And they're the type of athlete that you see constantly moving their hands, shuffling around, trying to balance that way. So how would you approach working with this client?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I know I've talked about this on podcasts before, and if anyone's ever taken a seminar or come to camp, they've heard me mention what I consider to be kind of the three pillars of a well-rounded handstand: the strength training, the muscle endurance component for longer duration handstands, the positional components of making sure you understand what good, aligned, efficient handstand looks like, and then the third being stability. And I break down stability of a handstand into two major pillars, one being micro stability, fine motor adjustments that allow the weight to be stayed centered over the hands, versus macro adjustments, major weight shifts that might happen, and understanding that those shifts normally need to be coming from the shoulders and making the adjustments either through opening up flexion past 180 versus what we consider to be more of a planching action forward. So someone who is having trouble with stability of the handstand normally never factors in stability specific drills. So how do my fingers actually play a role, or my wrist play a role if I'm on parallettes or on parallel bars, to be able to make the fine motor adjustments to be able to find that stable point? Versus if something major happens, how do I need to anticipate and prepare my shoulders to move forward and back to be able to keep that weight centered over my hands? So you start to need to apply some stability drills and conversation to the way that you're training. The easiest one, and the one that we normally see most often utilized, is something like a floater drill, where you're kicking up, and you can do this back to wall or stomach to wall. Normally, the easiest way as a starting point would be back to wall. I find about 8 to 10 inches away from the wall with the fingertips is kind of an optimal distance. Anything further than that, you're pitching yourself at too severe of an angle, and it's very difficult to find any real grip against the ground to be able to pull your feet away. If you're too close to the wall, any adjustment, you're just going to throw your feet past vertical and you're going to come down. So essentially with that particular drill, what you're going to try to do is dig the fingertips in, try to find a minor adjustment. Slowly start to pull the shoulders away, the hips away, and then the feet slowly peel away from the wall over time. What normally ends up happening is people are kicking away from the wall in that drill, and the lower half is doing nothing. The hands are doing nothing. The shoulders are doing nothing, and they have no understanding of actually where the stability is coming from. So it's a defeated exercise. They have no idea actually what the application is of that exercise. It can be very valuable if you know how to do it, but in my mind, it's more of a general comment. You need to be spending more time specifically on understanding micro adjustments through the fingertips and macro adjustments through being able to access more range through your shoulders, getting more muscle groups involved with the stability of your handstand. Just a quick last comment on that. If your shoulders are not able to open to or beyond 180 degrees, the anterior delt becomes the dominant muscle group that's involved with keeping you inverted. And what we would like to see is a range and a shifting of weight so that you can start accessing new muscle groups to be able to help stabilize. So by being able to open beyond, you can start accessing upper back, your traps, your rear delts, so you can start transferring stress and getting that weight to be distributed accordingly within different muscle groups.
All right,
Did I stay
Dave,
within my time?
you were right on it. Maybe a couple seconds over,
All
but
right.
you know, we're playing with house money right now. You guys are both doing good. So, Chris, I'll let you take over and offer any contrast or argument or agreement. Go ahead.
All right. I think there will be agreement, but also some slight differences too. So I think in general, sort of with the base principles, I agree. I mean, in different words, I initially look for structure through the body. So making sure we can sort of boardify, that's one synonymous term, I guess, just having this sort of unified structure from the wrist all the way to the toes. Once you have that, then you have the ability to control with the fine motor adjustments through the hands, like Dave was saying. I think maybe this is my hand balancing perspective or approach, but I encourage control only through the hands and fingers, and no shoulder control. And so it's completely one unified body from the wrist all the way to the toes, and then it's only the hands and the fingers manipulating just this small sway. Generally, if someone is all over the place moving their hands, yes, structure could be a problem. If that's not the problem, then it's control and not knowing how to use the hands. And primarily for overbalance, they probably are lacking strength in the hands and fingers in terms of being able to use it in overbalance, but also they might not be psychologically comfortable to kind of let themselves fall into overbalance just very, very slightly to be able to actually load the fingers. So I would go to the back to the wall floater drill. I would probably start someone off more around like 5 inches or so. I feel like any further than that, then there is a bit of a chest dump. There is about a bit of a sort of body English that it's sort of a forceful body mass movement away from the wall that deloads the fingers. And so you move them a little bit closer. They have to be in that strict, very straight position if they're going to float calmly off the wall. That's the basis, I guess. I don't know if forgetting things that came to mind. Yeah, but basically once they understand the floater drill and start to find that finger strength and whatnot, then you can put them in situations where they're just lightly floating into overbalance, whether it's a spotted situation or some sort of modified back to the wall position where they get the sense that they're moving towards overbalance and they're recognizing that, and then they have to use their fingers while they stay unified in their body, and they start to find that sort of back and forth sway of balance.
All right. So I will not forget this time. So Chris, good work. Dave, you've got 2 minutes to reply on that one.
Yeah, it's more of a question for Chris because I think we agree primarily around micro adjustments or fingertip adjustments being critical as a starting point. But I'm curious, Chris, from your perspective, in reality, I mean, even from the gymnastic side of things, there are points when an adjustment is needed that's more than just what the fingertips can handle, especially if you're falling back towards the direction that you're kicking up, right? So say you're falling backwards where the weight is more on the palm of your hands and you don't have the ability to grip. What happens in that scenario? For me, to be able to make that adjustment, I need to be able to planche. I need to be able to let my shoulders drift forward to get enough weight to be able to then center over my hands. So I'm curious from your perspective, if you don't recommend adjustments being done from the shoulders and primarily from the fingertips, what happens in scenarios where something major happens or if more of the weight is shifting back towards the palm of your hands in your coaching world?
Right. So with weight shifting back towards the palm, this may sound like an odd answer, but I would say just don't get to that point where instead of seeing that as an acceptable sort of, I don't know, solution, I guess, that your task is to stay within this range of sway, range of balance, where you never get to that point where weight doesn't drift all the way back to the palm and you have to make that major adjustment. And so, I mean, again, maybe this is the hand balancing world where it's like, okay, you can be super precise in your balance adjustments and almost as calm on your hands as you are on your feet. And it's like things are so dialed in. There are situations where, yeah, I'm pushing skills and I'm sort of at the edge of my ability, and yeah, it's going to be necessary to make those gross adjustments. But in the end product, I'm going to go for something that's super, super calm. And in general, I think that's what I encourage in general, and I think it's energy efficient. I think it's relaxing for the mind. It can be relaxing for the body. So that's my direction of hand balancing that I like to go, and I think it's a nice place.
All right, got it.
Dave, you feel good with that? We've still got another minute or two if you guys have any final thoughts on this piece.
Do you guys have any questions about that from your experience in training in this stuff?
Jordan?
Either of you?
I mean, I am definitely not at the point in my handstand or hand balancing journey where I have that sort of control that I'll never find myself drifting back into my palms. I will strive to get there though. And if I can make all my adjustments through my hand, I feel like that is kind of a nice place to be. The difference then I think would only be if you were talking to somebody who was, like a CrossFit athlete that wants to then move into other scenarios where they're walking or, doing something else other than static holds.
Yeah, that might be a separate conversation in general, but I'm just curious because both of you guys are training handstands, and I know Mike, you work with Chris, and Jordan, you've worked with Chris before in various points, and you guys have his perspective and his guidance, which is hugely helpful. But when you guys are on your own and you're working on these things, have you noticed anything that's been valuable in terms of what we've been discussing? So it's cool. You guys are basically the users. You guys are the end users that we're kind of trying to talk to here.
I'll say two things. I've been doing a lot more, not just floater drills, but the fingertip push-ups that you show. And I feel like that's like doing a floater drill, but way more intensely. And I find that when I've been working those into my daily warm-ups, that when I do get inverted now, it's like super confident of just like, I know I'm going to be not falling over at all.
Can you explain the drill so listeners can understand what it is?
Yeah, sure. So basically get into ideally you would be in a push-up position, but you're more than likely going to have to start with a push-up on your knees with your hands and wrists just below your shoulders. And then you're going to push through your fingertips to the point where your palms and your thumbs come up off the ground. Fingers stay on the ground, but your palms and your thumbs are up off the ground, and then a nice, slow, controlled descent back to palms in contact with the floor. So essentially, you're doing reps just through your fingertips, and it's very much like the floater drill, but you get even more range of motion on your fingers than you would if you were just keeping your palm completely flat on the ground on a floater drill.
Yeah, I guess I do have maybe a little bit of a thought from where you guys were both going on that, and with floaters in general, my experience and working on handstands in and out of frequency for the last 10 years, but really hard, I would say hard the last 2 or so years with a lot of added guidance from Chris now as I call him my handstand sensei. So if the listeners are curious why I don't have Dave work with me one-on-one, it's kind of one of those things when you're so close with somebody, it's not healthy for you to add another component to your relationship. So Dave is not only my colleague in coaching, he's my boss. He's like one of my best friends and like a brother. So I feel like the last thing that we need to do is put him into a coach or teacher role with me.
Well, Chris
So
is also amazing at what he does, so you're getting
Chris
some
also came highly
fantastic.
recommended, and that's one of the reasons why we like to have him on here with us. But practical question. So Dave, you were talking about, in the scenario of going into your palms and then maybe having to break at the shoulders or lean a little bit into a planche to save and push up. I've noticed that when I do back to wall floaters, that's more of a likely scenario. And then I've noticed when I do wall facing, it's much more likely that my shoulders stay pretty good, and then it is more hand dominant. But I could see where maybe a more beginner level athlete would be afraid of that, because then you do have that feeling of like, I'm going to fall over.
With the stomach to
And
wall variation.
yeah, so
Yeah.
like I like it at, let's say, at the level that I'm at now, because I feel like I can control that. So I like what it does of like really isolating things into my hands and forcing me to have a better body line. Whereas I feel like there's a little more yeah, forgiveness in the back to wall, but then at the same point, maybe not as strict with the body line. So that was kind of my overarching comment to you guys, if you had any thoughts on that.
Chris, I think you want to.
Well, I'll say that the back to the wall one, yeah. I mean, when you're a little bit closer, yes, I use that for, I think, to dial in the appropriate intensity, just so there isn't this massive tilt against the wall, and it's actually appropriate for the individual given the structure they have, given sort of hand and finger strength and whatnot. But when it's close, it's actually sort of a perceptive challenge where you can't push that hard. You can't go max effort because you are going to push into underbalance. And so it's not just a physical thing. It's like, okay, can you perceive where your body is in space, kind of based on what you're feeling under the fingertips or in the wrist or whatever? And can you stop that? And so it becomes a task of really being able to perceive what you're feeling in your body, which is incredibly important in hand balancing. And I think that's why I use that variation a lot.
I have a
Awesome.
question for Chris, actually. If you are finding yourself in a situation where you're like, pushing the limits of where you're at, you're trying to learn something new or something, and you're inverted and you're trying to keep your adjustments to your hands and fingertips, and you find yourself happening to go into the palm of your hand a little bit, will you, instead of using your shoulders, will you try to control that with your feet and maybe dump your feet in one direction or another to counteract that balance, or will you in fact use your shoulder macro adjustment?
Um, Trying to think of a situation just to like actually have a situation. I think it won't really be sort of conscious adjustments of the shoulders or elbow, perhaps. I mean, if I'm on one arm, there's going to be some elbow adjustment. If I'm in a unstable position, that's going to kick in instead of just the calmness of the hand. But yeah, it won't be conscious adjustment of the shoulder or the elbow. It'll be kind of like, okay, this is what I have to do to save myself in this situation, given sort of circumstances. I feel like leg movements, that's sort of hit or miss. Sometimes they work, but sometimes there's other effects throughout the body that just counter that movement completely, and it actually has no effect. And so that's not necessarily a go-to. I don't know. Does that answer your question
Yeah, I think
a
so.
little bit? Okay.
Yeah, last question, I guess, and this would be for both uh, Chris and Dave. I think this will apply to a lot of our listeners, because we're talking so much about, getting into some of these precise positions and then working on stability. So thinking of how a lot of people, whether they're doing floater work, or maybe they're just doing like quick kind of like kick up drills, trying to find their balance point. If somebody's really struggling or breaking positions, do you prefer that, Dave, you can go first. Do you prefer that they would, break at the shoulders to correct, or maybe move the feet a little bit and then reposition, or just kick back down and like start a fresh set?
I mean, depends what you're trying to get out of it. I mean, the kick up, just continuously kicking up is more to me a positional drill.
Hmm.
Because most people, especially again, I'm referring back to, Chris, you work a lot with hand balancers and circus performers, and we work a little bit more with CrossFit World. Maybe you do as well now, but most people's only route to training a handstand is back to wall. So they end up getting used to a severely arched, very poor position back, and they end up thinking that that's correct. So the kick up drills are meant to stay short of vertical, just to make sure that they're understanding that where vertical is probably very different perceptually than where they think it is. So just repeating that drill over and over again and staying short of vertical can be helpful in terms of understanding where their body is. If they're working more on the stability side and trying to understand fine motor adjustments, I would say work through the fingertips first. If something drastic happens and weight shift ends up, to me, it's inevitable. And I think I have a hard time understanding scenarios, and I'm putting myself even to a gymnastics perspective. I'm where maybe I'm in a handstand on parallel bars in a routine, and at the end, and I'm getting fatigued, and a bend of the elbow happens for me to be able to save my handstand, which throws my shoulders forward. I'm not able to make just the adjustments through the wrist at that point. There is some major weight shift going back and forth when you're trying to save handstands. And in an ideal world, maybe you don't want that to happen, but I feel like as fatigue sets in, it's going to be inevitable. So for me, understanding what the shoulders need to be doing forward to back and how to access the different muscle groups is pretty important. So I would say that if you're working more on the stability side, understanding how to make those adjustments to the shoulder is critical. If you're thinking more on the positional side of kick up, come back down and repeat the action. Does that make sense? It really is dependent on what the goal is of the exercise.
Yeah, and it was definitely a little bit of a leading question, and Chris, I'd like to hear from you, and then we'll move on to the next part.
Right. I totally agree that it depends on the goal of the exercise, and what the person wants to get out of it. And then also, I mean, if they are in a fatigue state, then and they are training handstands, then I'd look at like, okay, what's the mix of activity they're doing? What's the order of activity they're doing? What's their priorities in terms of handstands versus other activities? Where I'm not saying handstands always has to be the highest priority. I mean, it has to be complementary and sort of CrossFit scenario, but like figuring out how to structure training so they're not fatigued while they're always training handstands. So maybe they can get a little bit more out of it when they're in a little bit of a more fresh state. And then perhaps if they're in a fatigue state, just dialing drills to the point where that actually meets what they have for capacity, not doing the hardest level drill when they're pretty fatigued. Like let's make some changes so they can actually get something out of it. I will note that I do use a back to the wall handstand a lot, and I think just if there are positional adjustments, if the distance from the wall is appropriate, I think not everyone's going to be in an arch handstand, and so I think I wouldn't put back to the wall handstand to be synonymous with arch, just as a nuance point there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to mention that CrossFitters listen to that because there's value there, but just having more awareness around the setup is really critical. That's why like the positioning of the hands can turn those drills into something very valuable as opposed to just a way to get inverted. And so Chris's point is very well taken, that where you place your hands, all those things need to be done with intention so that you're getting the most out of the drill rather than just creating a bad habit that leads to poor precision. So I think that's a really important point, as long as we can emphasize the setup being critical.
Oh, really, really good. Thank you, guys, and I appreciate that you allowed some questions from the internal audience here with Jordan and I. So I'm feeling comfortable to move on to scenario 3 if you guys are ready. Yeah.
Good.
All right. So Chris, we'll start with you again. This scenario is going to be looking to see how would you approach to help a client who can hold a static handstand. Let's say they're in good position, even somewhere in that 30 to 60 second hold range, but they do struggle to take intentional steps without falling. So they're in that handstand and they actually can't move very well. And that's one of their goals, whether it's walking in a straight line, maybe doing pirouettes, or starting to develop their, lateral movements.
Okay. I'll say that walking is less of what I focus on for coaching, because I'm mostly focused on just staying in one place and being as still as possible. But in general, I mean, if I'm in a live situation, I'll be spotting their legs and just kind of walking with them, essentially, kind of stepping them through it a number of times, so that I essentially manage them falling. I want them to be falling towards me just a little bit, but not so much that they have to take these giant steps where it's going to freak them out or anything. That's part one. I mean, given that they have sort of a pretty solid hold, I wouldn't expect any strength deficiencies or anything like that. So I mean, there's probably some value in doing sort of wall shoulder taps and walks against the wall just for increased strength and endurance for a little bit more security. But that wouldn't be a huge concern. But the spotted situation would probably be my go-to number one. I would make smaller goals like, okay, let's try to take 2 or 3 steps and then step down, take 2 or 3 steps and step down. I would make sure they don't have the fear of falling over. Of course, given if they have a pretty solid hold, I would expect they know how to follow it safely and they can bail. It's possible their legs could just be loose and all over the place, and they don't have that structure, so they can't be sort of unified as they're stepping. So maybe it's a tension problem, and we could focus on details about that. Those would be my go-tos that I would probably look at first.
All right, Dave, your time to go.
All right, I'm going to break this down a little bit more because, in our world, we spend a little bit more time, yes, static, but application for workouts and walking and push-ups and those types of things. So I'm going to go into the way that I approach this, but then I have a question for Chris at the end that I'm curious about from his perspective from a hand balancing world. So what we normally see with athletes is that even if they are spending time on getting a nice static hold first, which is very rare, but if you have an athlete in that scenario, fantastic. But taking a step with purpose and intention is rarely done. So what I normally say is that even high-level handstand walkers in the CrossFit or functional fitness world, people that are good at it, are rarely not walking with purpose and intention with an efficient actual handstand walking step, or, like I said, purpose and intention with each hand going down to the ground. They're more masking those inefficiencies with a lot of strength. So you have these incredibly strong athletes, shoulders, upper back, traps, are just able to hold their weight inverted for long periods of time. So it doesn't mean that they're actually taking a step with purpose. It just means that they can stay inverted longer because they're strong. So I always tell people that's more, it's an eventual fall than it is an actual handstand walk. So what we would normally do is first work on understanding the shift that needs to happen. How do I shift my weight from one side to the other to be able to appropriately take a hand off the ground and take a step in a different direction on purpose, whether that's pirouetting or walking laterally or backwards or whatever that might be. After we start with the shifting drills, and Chris, you mentioned shoulder taps and shoulder touches, in most cases, the athletes that we work with are absolutely not ready to take that step, even people that can hold a handstand. They're just not understanding the lateral shift that needs to go into place before you can take a hand off the ground. So we would normally start with just shifting drills, keeping the palms firmly planted, shift, then work towards palm lifting, then eventually moving towards being able to take the hand off the ground, eventually working towards a side touch, eventually working towards one-arm holds so they can actually take a step with purpose. Beyond that, understanding how to bend and lock, where your hand is off the ground and you're able to create a relaxed state as opposed to staying stiff with every single hand placement, which is a contract state, which means that you're creating unnecessary fatigue within that muscle group with each and every step, if that makes sense. So a bending, more of a similar gait to what you'd be doing on your feet as opposed to staying stiff-limbed throughout each step. And then lastly, making sure that the position stays in place in terms of making sure the weight is traveling in the direction that you're trying to go. Now, most people's big limitation here is that they have a closed shoulder angle, whether that be a limitation in the upper back, T-spine mobility issues, or underarm soft tissue mobility issues that prevent them from being able to create a situation where all of their weight is traveling in the correct direction. So we would need to work on some mobility, some understanding of what is creating that lack of uniform arch position so they can actually create a stepping pattern, movement pattern that allows them to create the weight to move uniformly in the direction that they're trying to go. So for me, it's a little bit more of a breakdown. Eventually, we can work towards the spotting drills that we do, taking steps with some assistance. But for me, it's almost a step back, making sure people understand how to shift the weight, get the hand off the ground comfortably, take a step with purpose and intention, and then go from there.
Dave, did you have a question for Chris before
Yes.
I ask him if he had any? Yes, go for it.
Yeah. So my question for you, and I had this question for Yuval a while back. Yuval, another just complete genius in the handstand world. I'm sure you've worked with him, come cross paths with him in the past. We've had him on the podcast as well. And talked a little bit about the shifting and where the initiation of the shift when you are trying to get weight on a single hand, where it comes from. Now, in the hand balancing world, he was very clear that, the shifting that he initiates would come more from hip shifting, where the shoulders will stay stacked more over the hands, and you're initiating the shift more from the hips and from the feet, keeping the shoulder trying to stay directly up over the hand. And I totally get that. And when I'm working on one-arm work, I feel that, and I feel the advantages of that. When I'm trying to get someone to walk on their hands, I feel like it's much more of a pattern where, as if you're on your feet, shifting of the hip so that you can actually find a balance point on your foot is kind of what happens. On your hands, I find it to be beneficial to understand the shifting would come from the shoulder when you're actually trying to take a step. I find it very difficult to understand how you can take a step effectively if you are shifting from the hip in a hand balancing type of scenario. To me, they're different setups and they're different applications. I'm curious in your mind if you see the shifting being done differently between trying to find a one-arm balance position versus application to an actual walk.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, as you dive into the shift, it's making me think of a post I posted a number of years ago where it was just a slow motion entry into a one-arm handstand, and just kind of really trying to look at where the movement sort of initiates from, what's the sequence of events and everything. And it's interesting to watch in slow-mo. But yeah, I mean, it certainly is going to be sort of really getting that hip mass, getting all of the torso, the legs over in that direction on top of the shoulders so that you can stay in a stable position. And I think the key thing is that one, the one-arm handstand is going to be a static position, mostly static, quasi-static. And then the handstand walk is dynamic. If you There's a drill I like to do for one-arm handstands, finger taps, which is basically, I mean, it's probably similar to the walking progressions that you mentioned. It's just freestanding though, not against the wall. But the goal is to basically put your hand or to shift to one side with your body, lightly tap the floor with the fingers, and then put the hand exactly where it was before. No forward or backward movement, no sort of lateral movement. So it's very much a precision drill, but it's dynamic too. That's challenging. And then, I mean, you can bump up the intensity or the challenge of that, put your legs together, start tapping your side and stuff like that. So that has that full sort of body mass shift side to side. That's incredibly challenging. And so for someone who's learning handstand walking, who is still sort of relatively new to handstand, that's going to be absolutely impossible. So yeah, for someone learning handstand walking, there's probably going to have to be a shoulder shift, sort of torso shift to the side as sort of the hips and the legs kind of stay roughly centered or so. I would agree with that if that's roughly what you're thinking.
Yeah, that was my question. I was curious because, the hand balancing world is one thing, but application in terms of dynamic action, as you put it, walking, pirouetting, whatever it might be, I find it from my own training to be slightly different. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective. I know you probably don't do a lot of handstand walking, but just kind of curious if you've had a visual on it before.
I'm going to bring us all the way back to Dave's point early on, where when he was hoping that we'd have a little bit of time to look at another difference between the hand balancing world, or potential difference between the hand balancing world and the handstand world. And Dave, the fingertip position and so forth when you're handstanding, do you want to go ahead and ask that question of Chris?
Yeah, sure. So, Chris, is just very topical for us right now because we put a post out yesterday or recently on social media asking what's optimal in terms of fingertip direction for handstand walking. And, just from our perspective, because I know that we maybe even had this conversation when you're at camp or through emails over the years. And you work a lot on kind of a slanted board sometimes to take some stress off of the wrists. Is there an optimal position for the fingertips? Maybe not, whatever's comfortable. But what we're trying to get across is that the fingertips play a role in being able to take a step where you're actually controlling the steps as opposed to just weight dictating the direction that you're traveling. So a lot of athletes will turn their hands out quite a bit when they're handstand walking because it's less pressure on the wrists and they can dump more weight in that direction without stressing the wrists. So there's value in terms of them creating speed, but there's no control around it. I'm curious from your perspective if you find what might be optimal for you or the way that you train athletes around fingertip direction, if you see any value in terms of manipulating that position as people might start to walk.
I think, yeah, I mean, I'll speak to my case first, just as a starting point. But yeah, my wrists are are quite tight. They always have been. I used to swing pommel horse basically on my fingers and my thumbs, and my palm wouldn't touch the pommel horse. So I've always had that. So I mean, for me to do a handstand on the flat ground, I'm going to have very little range of sway. It's probably going to be pretty painful on my wrist too, and so that's why I work on a tilted board. If I am walking, yeah, my hands are turned out to the side just to accommodate my wrists. And so, I mean, I think that's speaking to if someone has like a physical limitation that requires some sort of variation or orientation and of the hands and the fingers in this case, and it can get the job done. Maybe it's not optimally, but it can get the job done. Then okay, that's what you have to work with. So, I mean, let's push this as much as we can. I think when I also walk with my hands out to the side, I mean, it's lazy, I guess, in that sense, because I can kind of waddle and I don't have to like bend my elbows and shoulders, and I don't have to lift too much. So in that respect, it's almost like energy conservation. Do I have enough control to do what I want to do? Yes, in that case. And so I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've really thought about optimal finger position in the walking. I think there's a potential for control, for sure, like you said. I think I just haven't had enough experience with walking to really dive into that.
That makes sense. It makes sense. And I appreciate your comment being that you're an athlete at a super high level within handstands that has wrist mobility issues. And this is something we come across quite often with our community. And again, a question that I've asked you all in the past, and I want to ask you the same thing around this, because we try to put some emphasis around the importance of building some additional exercise and accessory work around getting the wrist to be strong and mobile and prepared for what they're going to be doing with a lot of handstand work, plus a lot of heavy overhead work with barbells and front rack positions and application to a lot of the other CrossFit things. And I asked this question to Yuval, and he's like, I don't do any handstand prep. He's like, wrist prep. He's like, I just do my handstands, and my handstands are my wrist prep. And so he was basically saying that it's his preparation for his wrists is a function of what he's already doing with his handstand work. And I'm curious if you spend any specific time, especially considering the limitations you have in your wrists, on trying to get them more mobile or preparing them for when you have a handstand session, or is it just something that you kind of work into with your sessions?
I think I would be in line with Yuval in this one. I mean, pre-handstand, just considering the tightness, I do stretch out my fingers, I do stretch out my forearms and whatnot, just to sort of break off the rust in that respect for the day and actually have some usable range of motion. But I think yeah, the handstand training is my preparation. Yes, I'm putting them in situations where they are stressed and they're pushing their limitations in terms of load, in terms of control, in terms of range of motion and whatnot. But I also know not to push them too far, and I think that's a really important thing about wrists. I mean, once you start getting upside down, you can't just neglect what your wrists are saying and whatnot, and you can't just push through. Wrists are too finicky to sort of play with fire like that. I think wrists are kind of a hit or miss body part in terms of gaining range of motion. I would say, yes, there's a variety of things you can do to try to increase range of motion and prep them and stuff like that, but sometimes they just don't respond. Shoulders, I mean, 95% of the time they're going to respond. That's more of a certain body part. But wrists, they're a little bit more, they have a mind of their own, and sometimes they don't come along.
Understandable. Last question for me. Do you wear any wrist wraps or tape up your wrists whenever you're training?
I don't, no.
Okay. All right. Mike, Jordan, go for it.
Yeah, it's always fun, especially when you guys get into some of the finer details of the handstand positions, because there's so much parallel or similarity to squat, functioning and technique and different preferences for different movers. And I guess the one thing that kind of made sense to me, and it's something that I think I've probably heard both of you talk about, is like having an understanding of what's possible. I wouldn't even say like what's ideal or what's optimal, but just what's possible, and then almost where you fall along the spectrum. So I'm comparing that a little bit to squatting, and Chad and I definitely encourage people to squat more square than what we see the general population doing. And that's just because we think most people like give up too quick and don't see what they're capable of. And Dave, I think definitely with us in the CrossFit world with handstand positioning, I think people just automatically go to hands turned out because they've seen somebody do it, or it just feels like the most comfortable right off the bat, and they never explore another position. And then, Chris, it was like you were kind of saying to some of the earlier answers, like exploring all the options and seeing what's there, and then having an awareness, or we're lucky when we have a question about something, we can all ask each other or go to our physios and things like that. But for the listeners out there, like if you're going to do a skill and you're going to work on something, you're going to get better, like get good resources. Like, follow us, listen to the conversations we have, work with the coaches at your gym that, are going out and learning, because a lot of times there's a handful of ways to approach something within the parameters of like safety and functionality. That was my big preach to end it, Dave.
I appreciate that, Mike. A lot of good comments in there. Something I want to just follow up on. But Jordan, anything you want to add?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you guys talk about this.
Awesome. Chris, I appreciate your passion on this stuff and your insight. It's always great to chat with you. I always learn something. I'm always fascinated by the research that you're doing in handstands, and I would love people to be able to follow you and all the stuff that you're doing. Do you have a place where people can kind of like see all the kick-ass stuff that you're doing on this side of the world?
Well, I'm not too active on Instagram, but I do have an account under Bearded Man. I have a website, chrisgatti.com. I should be more active on Instagram. Yeah, I'll start posting again.
I will say that during the lockdown, you posted something on Instagram that I thought was genius, and it was something like, you were like, "Hey, did anybody else figure out that if you set up your computer and you have a Zoom call with yourself on your phone, and you put your phone under your face while you're doing a handstand, and you're zooming with your computer that's looking at you, you can actually see your handstand in real time and where you need to make adjustments and so forth." And I thought that was like
Brilliant.
That was genius. I'm like,
this is so valuable. Like, especially for like chest to the wall stuff, where if someone's working on sort of position refinement with that, or trying to get a nice tall shoulder push, sort of a flat / rounded spine, push your pelvic tilt and everything. Most of the time, especially if someone's remote, it's going to take them a long time to figure out. You put that camera set up there, they can see exactly what's happening. They can figure out, okay, I do this change, that happens. I do this change and that happens. It is so valuable. And so it's useful in situations where you have sort of excess cognitive bandwidth to be able to pay attention to what's happening under the screen and then make some changes. And so if you're really good balancing, you can do it when you're freestanding balancing and play with stuff like that. But yeah, it's a valuable one.
Love it.
That's a level up to Dave. We're always telling everybody to video themselves more. So that's the next level of start real-time zooming yourself to make the corrections.
Without a doubt. Extreme value there. Figure out where you are versus where you think you are. Right. Always very, very different things. That's for sure. Mike, Jordan, anything you want to finish up with?
No, I'm very, very happy with where we went with this. I think, again, just like we had in the weightlifting kind of discussion, and now in a gymnastics one, I think we're just going to continue to draw from a lot of the questions that we get from our community that are always coming up and regular, and bring in other people that we respect, like Chris, to have some good conversations about technique and positions and ways to continue to progress the community and their movement quality.
I just want one more question for Chris. Chris, do you have any handstand goals that you're working on right now? Anything that you're specifically, is there a performance, an act, or anything that you're working on, or is it more just maintenance at this point?
Just training. I actually don't perform. I haven't performed hand balancing. I was in Cirque Du Soleil for another act, so it's just a hobby. But one arm stalder press. That's
one arm stalder press.
Maybe 6 months away or so. Yeah.
Amazing. We'll keep an eye on the progress there. Please post your progress on Instagram so we can all follow along with that badass move. That would be amazing to watch. Thanks again, man. Always great chatting. For everyone else out there, appreciate the time and listening to the nuance that goes along with handstands. We love this stuff. Follow up and send us messages on the movements that you would like to hear us break down. We'll bring in the experts and make sure you guys have all the valuable insight. Be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com for services and upcoming events. Check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, at Mike Service, and at Jordan Samuel Photo on behalf of Power Monkey Fitness. We're your hosts. I'm Dave Durante with Mike Service, and until next time, thank you all for listening.